So, whatever happened to that classic Irwin Allen TV show Land of the Giants? Let's find out. Movies,
music, and monsters.
Hey guys, Dan Monroe here talking about movies, music, and monsters. Irwin Allen took us deep into the depths with Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, into the far reaches of outer space with the Robinson family in Lost in Space, and hurtling through history itself in The Time Tunnel. But this time, he set off to embark on his biggest adventure on the small screen yet. And yes, I mean big. Land of the Giants, another classic sci-fi adventure show by the master of disaster, Irwin Allen. Being a young second-generation Irwin Allen fan, I wasn't able to experience all the excitement of his shows when they were actually broadcast back in the day. But I always knew I could catch one of these on TV if I made it home from school on time, and if I got that aerial pointed in just the right direction. You know, as a kid watching this show, I distinctly remember thinking to myself, wow, this is just like Lost in Space. You got the older, silly guy who was kind of like Dr. Smith. You had the young boy who was kind of like Will. You got the ship crashed on the planet with the crew trying desperately to get home. I don't know, it all just seemed really familiar to me. It wasn't actually till much later in life that I learned to have much more of an appreciation for Land of the Giants, so let's dive in. Like Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and Lost in Space, the cast of Land of the Giants was nothing less than spectacular. You got Gary Conway, who received top star billing in the credits. Don Marshall and the rest of the actors were simply billed as also starring. God, Deanna Lund was gorgeous.
We felt so foolish, looking up at the Klieg light and pretending. But when it was all put together and we saw how Irwin was a magician and he made it work.
The most humorous moments would happen when you thought you were maybe talking to a giant, and that was what your whole emotional fabric would be all about. And then later on when they cut, you found that actually you were talking to a giant chicken.
Kurt Kasner, who played Fitzhugh, was treated very similar to the way Jonathan Harris was in Lost in Space, again receiving last spot in the credits with special guest star every week. Not really sure why they went that route a second time other than maybe audiences were used to it with Lost in Space. I don't know. This show had a whopping budget of over $250,000 per episode, which actually set a new record at the time for being the most expensive TV show to that point. The immense cost was partially because of the special optical effects needed to mat in the little people into the shots with the giants, and also because all those oversized sets and physical props for the actors to interact with. Those things were not only unique, but expensive. But we'll touch on that in just a little bit. And like most all the pilots that he wrote, Irwin Allen also directed the pilot to Land of the Giants. In the original unaired pilot of Land of the Giants, all the main characters were really fleshed out quite heavily, which was great. During the 2 seasons of the show, not so much. But eventually, when confirmation came in that the show had been picked up by the network, they took the pilot, similar to what they did in Lost in Space, and cut down some scenes, condensed some scenes for the broadcast pilot, and even added a bunch of new special effects shots like all the giant animals. Again, like Lost in Space, Irwin Allen turned to the incomparable composer Johnny Williams to compose the score. Like Space, John Williams composed 2 different incredible themes, one for each season. Gary Conway, Don Marshall, and the rest of the cast really had to be in tip-top physical condition because, believe it or not, they did most of their own stunts. The actors like to say it's because it added realism to the shot, but it was actually a cost-cutting measure. Irwin Allen knew that if they were doing their own stunts, he wouldn't have to hire stunt people to do it. I mean, don't get me wrong, Irwin Allen was a brilliant director, but man, was he cheap. Using the same sets show after show, using the same monsters show after show. But also keep in mind this was the 1960s and these shows were meant to be aired once and then maybe go into syndication a couple of times. Nobody back then had any idea that fans like us would be going over these shows with a fine-tooth comb decades later. Not really fair to the show, but it certainly is fun. This is interesting. Generally, episodes of Land of the Giants were filmed 2 at a time. The producers would decide ahead of time what sets and props were going to be used for a specific story, and then they would write a second story based on those same sets and props. And when those 2 were done, they would come up with 2 new stories using specific sets and props and then go film 2 more. A cost-saving measure that proved to work. Then, to save even more money, Irwin Allen did the same thing with Land of the Giants that he made famous with the Time Tunnel, reusing old footage from 20th Century Fox's film library. In one show called Collector's Item, they even used footage of Wayne Manor from Batman as a mansion home of a rich giant. I mean, holy stock footage, Batman! Yeah, Batman. Video on that coming soon. Stay tuned. Land of the Giants was originally intended to premiere as a mid-season replacement in the spring of 1968, and the first 12 episodes were shot in the fall of 1967. This was later changed, and Land of the Giants premiered in September 1968 for a full season. As was pretty common back in the day, the network would screen episodes in a completely different order than what they were filmed in. This caused really weird lapses in continuity, especially with the Giants. In the first 12 episodes, the Giants moved really slowly and rarely spoke at all. And when they did, it was kind of this garbled, weird, alien-type language that you could barely understand. But as a kid, I thought that was really cool. It really made me think like this crew had crashed on a really bizarre alien world. But then, all of a sudden, the Giants speak perfect English and are easily able to communicate with the cast. They never really gave an explanation for this, but I can only assume that it's because the writers felt it was easier to write stories when the cast could actually talk to the Giants. Yeah, makes sense from a writing standpoint, but I really thought the Giants were much creepier in the first 12 episodes. And apparently, the Spindrift wasn't the only ship to crash on the Land of the Giants. A bunch of different episodes established the fact that at least 6 other flights landed on the planet. I don't know, you'd think after the 5th flight was mysteriously lost that somebody in charge of flights might decide to start canceling those trips from Los Angeles to London. I don't know, just a suggestion. When Land of the Giants premiered, it was the most expensive show ever produced on television up to that time. Many of the props used in this show, like the computers, the guns, were also used in Lost in Space, The Time Tunnel, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and Batman. It's kind of funny, even though this show is supposed to take place on a completely different planet, you can clearly see Chrysler corporations on many of the cars and trucks in the show. But that does make total sense considering Chrysler was the automaker contracted with the studio at the time. Product placement, way to go. Interesting, Heather Young, who played stewardess Betty Hamilton, she was pregnant for much of the show's second season. So rather than write that into the show, they just filmed her from the waist up or put her in really baggy outfits, or they would write her out of episodes completely. How rude. Interesting. To cut down costs even further, many of those oversized props, those were actually rented from Universal Studios prop store where they had been built for the film The Incredible Shrinking Man 11 years earlier. Kinda cool. The overly flamboyant characteristics of Fitzhugh obviously came from Dr. Smith from Lost in Space. No question. They're both cowardly. They're both greedy. They both have a mysterious past. Well, I guess if it works once, it works twice. Coincidentally, Jonathan Harris was actually in one of the episodes called Pay the Piper, and he was his usual villainous, comedic, over-the-top character, which made him famous in Lost in Space.
Land of the Giants, yes. Do you want to work for Irwin again? I said, no. I said, what? He said, Land of the Giants. I said, oh, okay. And I enjoyed it. It was a very good one, as a matter of fact.
And then, of course, there's the giant hand. Oh, how Irwin Allen loved that giant hand. Of course, every time you see the giant's hand in a show, it's obviously the same hand. I wonder where that giant hand ever ended up. I'm going to have to look into that. Land of the Giants premiered September 22nd, 1968, and was a huge hit with both families and children. It did so well that it was almost immediately picked up for a second season, which premiered September 21st of 1969 for a grand total of 51 episodes of Land of the Giants. The final episode, Graveyard of Fools, was broadcast on March 22nd, 1970, and like the cast of Lost in Space, fans of the show were sadly never given the opportunity to see their friends get home. And like Lost in Space, to this day, they still haven't. What a shame. And somewhat of a missed opportunity. But then, like all good things, Land of the Giants was canceled. Why? Good question. Not really sure. Probably mostly to do with the extremely high cost of producing each episode. Also, keep in mind, back then it was very common practice for studios to produce just enough shows to get the show into syndication, which Land of the Giants immediately went into. Well, Land of the Giants came and Land of the Giants went, but that certainly wasn't the end of the show's popularity, I can tell you that. All 51 episodes were released on DVD in a limited edition 9-disc set in 2007, which includes the unaired pilot and really cool interviews with most of the cast. We had that very cool GAF Viewmaster reel and book in 1968, which was based on the pilot. Also in 1968, Pyramid Books published an extended novel adaptation of the pilot, and Gold Key Comics also put out a really cool comic book version which ran 5 issues. And then we had the models. Oh man, the incredible Aurora model kits. I mean, come on, who didn't have those? Obviously, for Lost in Space, we had the robot and the giant, but for Land of the Giants, we had the giant snake model as well as the really cool Spindrift model. Interesting that on the box of the Spindrift model, it simply said Land of the Giants Spaceship instead of using the actual name of the ship. Why? I don't know. Lines are open. You decide. The Spindrift model was so popular that in 1975, Aurora reissued the kit, this time called Rocket Transport Spindrift, with new artwork on the box. Really cool. And what would a classic sci-fi TV show be without the metal lunchbox? Well, in 1969, we got one. This is kind of cool. Deanna Lund, who played Valerie, co-wrote a series of short stories based on Land of the Giants called Valerie in Giant Land. Now, as we've already talked about, probably the coolest aspect of Land of the Giants was, of course, the spaceship Spindrift. This ship is not only an iconic piece of sci-fi television history, but what happened to the ship after Land of the Giants was even more fascinating. Even as we speak, I personally know a guy right now who is helping to restore one of the original Spindrift models from Land of the Giants, but that, my friends, is the topic of another video. I really hope you guys enjoyed that retrospective on Land of the Giants, and if you did and you like this kind of stuff, please consider subscribing. I have got a ton of new videos coming up that I know you guys are just going to dig. If anybody has any questions that I think I can answer, drop them in the comments and I'll do my best. And please feel free to stop back anytime as we continue our conversation on movies, music, and monsters. Movies,
music, and monsters.